Usually when we look at a 3D architectural render of a new mega project, like one of those sweeping cinematic fly-throughs, showing a glittering glass tower piercing the clouds.
Oh, right, with the perfect lighting.
Exactly. The perfect lighting, maybe it's seamlessly integrated into the coastline. There is this expectation of just, well, absolute frictionless precision. The digital model makes it look like pure, unadulterated engineering.
It really does. It's so clean.
Right. You map out the structural grid, you place the steel, pour the concrete, slap on the high-performance glazing, and suddenly you have this skyline-defining asset. The digital twin makes everything look incredibly easy.
Well, I mean, it creates a dangerous illusion, honestly. It's this illusion of binary execution.
How do you mean?
Like the assumption that the building is either, in the design phase or it's in the construction phase, and the transition between those two states is just perfectly predictable.
Right.
We naturally gravitate toward that visible, tangible progress that those 3D models provide.
Right. But the moment you step off that shiny presentation stage and, into the actual on-the-ground reality of mega project delivery, especially in the Gulf Cooperation Council region right now, that pristine blueprint is just immediately covered in the mud of commercial reality.
Oh, absolutely covered in it. The project delivery landscape we are looking at in 2026 is it's exceptionally complex.
Yeah.
We're dealing with an ecosystem where the physical engineering is, arguably it's the easiest part of the job now.
Wow, really? The engineering is the easy part.
Yeah, the physical engineering has largely been solved. We know how to build tall. We know how to build big.
Right.
The true complexity lies in the diagnostic muddy water surrounding the build. Behind those beautiful glass facades is a highly volatile matrix of hidden legal exposures.
And fracturing global supply chains, right?
Exactly, fracturing supply chains and compounding environmental pressures. These forces are fully capable of bringing a multi-billion-dollar project to a grinding halt before the piling rigs even mobilize.
That is wild. So welcome to this highly tailored deep dive into the sources you provided us. We are extracting the absolute most critical intelligence from this stack to deliver what is essentially an advanced, technically rigorous masterclass on construction risk management in the GCC region for the year 2026.
It's a critical topic right now.
Because in a market that's globally recognized for unprecedented ambition and honestly massive capital deployment, it is remarkably easy to fall into the trap of thinking that successful delivery is merely a function of having sufficient funding.
Right, like just throw money at it and have a bold design.
Exact.
Which is perhaps the most dangerous misconception circulating in the industry today. What the data and the current market analyses reveal is a much quieter yet absolutely crucial force dictating project outcomes.
Which is proactive risk management, right?
Exactly. Proactive, aggressive risk management. Developers across the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the wider GCC, they are still moving forward with these high-risk, unprecedented mega projects. But
they're armoring themselves.
Yes, heavily. They are only doing so because they are heavily armoring themselves commercially and contractually.
So if you're listening to this, whether you are currently pricing a massive tender or actively managing a complex site, or maybe you're deep in the trenches of untangling a convoluted extension of time claim, this deep dive is designed as your blueprint.
You'll need it.
Yeah, because we are navigating a market where contractor margins are razor thin and where a single, misunderstood clause in a bespoke contract amendment can entirely erase a year of corporate profitability.
Or bankrupt a company entirely.
Exactly. So to really grasp the mechanics of this, we have to start well before the concrete bashing plant is even set up. We need to look at the macro environment.
Right. Starting with the physical climate and the authorities regulating it, the macro environmental pressures on GCC megaprojects have reached a critical threshold.
It's not just abstract models anymore.
No, not at all. We are no longer discussing long-term climate models. We are dealing with immediate, tangible changes to the physical chemistry and the operational logistics of a live construction site.
Yeah, the sources highlight a particularly alarming data point that really contextualizes this shift. We are seeing a global average temperature rise of 1.6 degrees Celsius in March compared to pre-industrial baselines.
Well, it's just staggering.
It really is. And while that clearly threatens broader climate goals, its immediate application to a live construction site in the GCC is profound.
It alters the fundamental parameters of how materials behave, honestly,
Yeah.
and how work is sequenced.
Right.
When the ambient temperature rises that significantly, especially during the shoulder seasons and peak summer months, you are dealing with accelerated material degradation.
So the thermodynamics of the site literally change.
Completely. For instance, think about structural concrete. The hydration curve of concrete is highly sensitive to ambient heat.
So it cures too fast.
Exactly. Managing the curing process to prevent thermal cracking becomes significantly more complex and expensive. You have sustained heat and fine dust infiltration, wreaking havoc on sensitive mechanical components, specialized facade adhesives.
Even the heavy machinery itself.
Oh, yeah. Engines overheat, hydraulic fluids degrade faster. It's a nightmare.
I imagine the increased thermal load also heavily impacts the workforce, which that ties directly into the regulatory frameworks governing site safety.
Yes, the safety regulations are a huge factor here.
The sources heavily emphasize the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization MOHRE and their mandatory midday break policies.
The MOHRE summer working ban. It's a fascinating study in how a vital health and safety regulation acts as a massive stress test for a project's scheduling logic.
Because you can't just work through the heat.
No, during the hottest months, site work must completely cease during peak midday hours. From a critical path perspective, this is not just a simple pause.
Right. It's not like pausing a video and hitting play again. The logistical friction of shutting down a massive site and restarting it hours later has to be enormous.
It's unbelievable.
Like, I'm trying to visualize the mechanics of this. You have a massive pour scheduled, you have tower cranes operating, you have hundreds of operatives scattered across a 50-story structure.
Yeah.
Stopping all that momentum, clearing the work face, and then remobilizing everyone later.
Yeah.
That effectively cuts a massive hole in your daily productivity.
It totally guts your productivity.
So how does a planning engineer build a realistic baseline schedule when a critical chunk of the working day is legally blocked off for months at a time?
Well, that specific logistical friction is why the MOHRE summer working ban is explicitly identified in the intelligence as one of the top 5 most consistently damaging risks to a project's timeline.
If it's not mitigated, right?
Exactly. If it's not heavily mitigated at the pre-contract stage, it forces planning engineers to dramatically alter their sequence of works.
So they shift to night shifts.
Often, yes, but that introduces a whole cascade of secondary risks.
Like what?
Increased costs for site lighting, for one, lower overall productivity due to worker fatigue, and then you have immediate clashes with local municipal noise ordinances if the site is near residential zones.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the noise complaints.
Yeah, you can't be running heavy breakers at 2 a.m. in a mixed-use neighborhood.
So if a contractor accepts a rigid, aggressive timeline to build a tower, say an 18-month delivery, and their Primavera P6 schedule doesn't explicitly model the loss of hundreds of highly productive working hours over 2 separate summer periods.
You're doomed.
Right. They are structurally setting themselves up for failure before they even sign the contract.
Precisely. They will inevitably fall behind schedule, which triggers delay damages, which then triggers the whole dispute resolution machinery.
The thermal reality of the region has to be mathematically modeled into the baseline schedule.
It has to be. And furthermore, the regulations extending beyond just worker safety are profoundly reshaping the industry. We are seeing a massive structural shift toward stricter compliance and ESG requirements.
The Dubai Green Building Regulations are a prime example of this from the sources.
Oh, definitely.
The mandates now dictate significantly enhanced thermal insulation standards, the required integration of solar energy infrastructure,
and highly specific, trackable, sustainable waste disposal mechanisms for all new builds.
It's a lot of red tape.
Well, it represents a permanent market correction. Building to these enhanced ESG standards is no longer just some public relations exercise.
Right, it's not just a plaque on the wall.
Exactly. It is a foundational legal requirement.
Yeah.
And crucially, it is an economic imperative driven by the capital markets.
Because the institutional investors funding these massive developments, like the global sovereign wealth funds, the major pension funds, they have strict internal ESG mandates.
Very strict. If a developer delivers a non-compliant, energy-inefficient asset in 2026, they are essentially building a stranded asset.
A stranded asset. What does that mean in this context?
An asset that no major institutional fund will acquire and no top-tier corporate tenant will lease. The cost of capital for non-green projects is just skyrocketing.
So the developer's operating in this tightening vice. The physical climate is demanding more resilient engineering. The municipal authorities are demanding strict green compliance.
And the global capital markets are demanding pristine ESG credentials.
It's coming from all sides, and simultaneously, the local financial regulators are heavily tightening their oversight.
Yeah, the financial scrutiny is intense.
The sources detail the increased scrutiny from regulatory bodies like the Dubai Real Estate Regulatory Agency (ARRA) regarding project escrow rules and the reporting requirements tied to off-plan sales.
The liquidity mechanisms of the entire market are being heavily audited.
Wow.
The days of loose cash flow management between projects are completely over.
So they can't just move money from Tower A to finish Tower B.
Absolutely not. Regulators require absolute transparency to ensure that capital raised for a specific development is irrevocably ring-fenced for that development.
And the stakes for a developer missing these financial disclosure mechanisms are existential, right?
Oh, massive. It can lead to the immediate suspension of their ability to market and sell properties,
Wow.
or severe financial penalties, or even the complete revocation of their developer license.
Which means the developer's administrative burden is higher than ever, and their access to flexible liquidity is highly constrained by these escrow rules.
And that invariably impacts how quickly they can certify and pay the main contractor.
Right, it all flows downstream.
Yeah.
The regulatory requirements to build greener, safer, and with perfect financial transparency inherently drive up the baseline cost of construction.
And this rising baseline is colliding violently with a period of severe global economic volatility.
So let's talk about the money trap. This transition from the macro-regulatory environment directly into the daily financial reality of procuring materials is where the margins are truly made or lost.
This is where it gets really painful.
We're seeing local GCC construction sites becoming direct casualties of global geopolitics and trade fragmentation.
The intersection of local ESG mandates and global supply chain volatility creates a very specific vulnerability for contractors in 2026.
The data in the sources points to a very specific painful metric. Recent U.S. government tariff hikes have created a massive ripple effect reaching all the way into the GCC.
Yeah, it's driving projected cost increases of up to 7% on critical imported materials.
7%. We're talking about high-grade steel, specialized aluminum for facades, advanced mechanical components, and the high-end architectural finishes that define these mega projects.
A 7% hit on the material cost of a billion-dollar asset is enough to completely wipe out a contractor's profit margin.
It's a fatal blow, especially to any contractor operating under a fixed lump sum contract that they priced, 18 months ago?
Exactly. The assumption of stable commodity pricing is no longer valid.
I am curious about the strategic sourcing here, though. If importing these specific materials exposes the project to such severe global shipping volatility and tariff-driven inflation, why is there still such a heavy reliance on imported components?
It's a fair question.
Why hasn't the local manufacturing base completely absorbed this demand to insulate these projects from global shocks?
Well, that exposes the central paradox of the current GCC construction market. We discussed the strict new smart and sustainable building regulations, right?
Yeah, the ESG mandates.
To achieve the required thermal performance, energy efficiency, and overall ESG ratings, developers cannot just use standard, locally abundant materials.
They can't just buy local block and cement.
No, they are mandated to utilize highly specialized, technologically advanced components. I'm talking hyper-efficient HVAC chillers, next-generation photovoltaic glass, low-carbon structural steel.
And those aren't made locally.
The manufacturing base for these highly specialized, eco-friendly materials is still heavily concentrated in specific global hubs.
Oh, wow. So the very regulations designed to make the buildings locally sustainable are forcing developers to rely on highly extended, fragile global supply chains.
Exactly. By striving to comply with advanced green mandates, the project profile becomes highly exposed to global trade wars, shipping lane reroutes, and container shortages. It is a structural vulnerability.
And the physical manifestation of that vulnerability is delay.
Massive delay.
The sources indicate that over 30% of GCC construction projects have experienced measurable timeline slippage over the last 12 months. And that is entirely due to supply chain constraints, port congestion, and material shortages.
1 in 3 projects.
1 in 3 projects is delayed simply because the physical components cannot get to the site on time.
The traditional just-in-time delivery model, which the industry relied on for decades to minimize on-site storage costs, it's completely failed in this environment.
It just doesn't work anymore.
No. Forward-thinking developers and Tier 1 contractors are fundamentally restructuring their procurement strategies to mitigate this.
They are shifting to multi-supplier strategies, right? Heavily diversifying their sourcing so They aren't entirely dependent on a single manufacturing hub,
Right. They also utilizing forward purchasing.
meaning they buy it way early.
Yeah, locking in material orders months or even years in advance and taking on the massive upfront capital costs of warehousing those materials locally just to guarantee availability.
Which requires tremendous balance sheet strength.
It really does. But the most significant shift is the heavy reliance on predictive modeling, specifically the advanced utilization of building information modeling, or BIM, and digital twin technology.
The application of digital twins here is fascinating because it goes far beyond clash detection or just simple 3D visualization. We were talking about 4D and 5D BIM, where the digital replica is intimately tied to the live project schedule and the real-time supply chain data.
It transforms project management from a reactive discipline to a predictive one. A sophisticated project director can use the digital twin to run complex scenario analyses. If intelligence suggests that a shipment of specialized curtain wall glazing is going to be delayed at a port for 4 weeks, they can input that data into the model.
And what happens?
The software instantly recalculates the critical path, highlighting exactly which downstream trades, like the MEP rough-ins, the interior fit-out will be starved of work.
So it allows the management team to actively resequence the workflow.
Precisely. Perhaps accelerating work on a different elevation of the tower before the delay actually manifests on the physical site.
They are solving the bottleneck in the digital space before it hits the physical space.
It is incredibly powerful. However, the sources heavily caution that while these technological interventions are vital, they cannot solve the underlying commercial rot that still plagues the industry.
The commercial rot.
Yeah, there is a systemic psychological risk that completely undermines all of these advanced risk management tools.
And that is?
The persistence of the lowest bid mentality.
Ah, right. The competitive dynamics of the tendering process in the GCC often drive contractors to make, frankly, commercially suicidal decisions.
Suicidal is the right word.
Because the market for these massive projects is so fiercely competitive, we see contractors deliberately underpricing their bids simply to secure the cash flow and the prestige of the award.
They are actively signing contracts where the modeled profit margin is razor thin or even negative.
Negative. Why would they do that?
Operating on the dangerous assumption that they can aggressively recover their margins later through variations, scope changes, and complex claims.
It is an operating model predicated entirely on conflict.
Yes, and what makes this lowest bid approach so destructive in 2026 is that employers are highly aware of this tactic.
They know it's coming.
And they have adapted their contracts accordingly. Contractors are winning these low bids by agreeing to heavily modified bespoke contracts that severely restrict their ability to claim that money back.
The sources specifically point to the aggressive amendment of standard forms, like the FIDIC Silver Book.
Which is notorious for this.
Right now, the Silver Book is inherently designed for EPC engineering, procurement, and construction turnkey projects, where the contractor knowingly accepts a higher degree of risk in exchange for a higher price.
But in the current GCC market, we are seeing developers take the Silver Book and completely rewrite the particular conditions to create an almost absolute transfer of risk onto the contractor.
The reallocation of ground risk is the most egregious example from the reading.
It's shocking.
Under standard equitable contracting principles, the employer should retain the risk for unforeseeable physical conditions, right?
Right. If the contractor hits an unmapped subterranean river or a massive cavern of solid rock that wasn't in the geotechnical baseline report, the employer should bear that cost.
But the bespoke amendments we are seeing explicitly strip that protection away.
Completely. The contract will contain a heavily drafted clause stating that the contractor has fully satisfied themselves as to the nature of the ground and subsoil.
Effectively making any geotechnical nightmare the contractor's sole financial responsibility.
And they are agreeing to this on a fixed lump sum basis.
Even more dangerously, they're committing to these lump sum prices when the IFC drawings, the issue for construction drawings, are fundamentally incomplete.
They're locking in a rigid price to construct an asset whose design is still evolving. They're absorbing massive design development risk without pricing it into their bid.
And because they strategically underprice the job to win it, they immediately begin stripping out internal costs to try and salvage some semblance of a margin.
Which is the ultimate false economy.
The sources highlight that the very first thing to get cut is the budget for essential commercial support.
Exactly. They reduce the headcount of the quantity surveying teams, they forego external legal counsel during the contract review phase, and they don't deploy dedicated claims preparation specialists.
By saving a fraction of a percent on commercial support during the tender and mobilization phases, they entirely disarm themselves for the battles to come.
Right, so when that 7% material inflation hits, or when the supply chain delay pushes them off the critical path, they lack the administrative firepower to defend their position.
They don't have the personnel to track the granular cost impacts, properly administer the complex notice provisions, or legally substantiate their entitlement to an extension of time.
They simply bleed cash because they cannot commercially defend the physical work they're doing.
And when a Tier 1 main contractor starts hemorrhaging cash on a lump sum mega project, they do not suffer in isolation.
No, it never stays with them.
That immense financial pressure inevitably seeks the path of least resistance, rolling directly downhill. Which brings us to the structural fragility of the supply chain itself, the subcontractor domino effect, and the immense complexities of back-to-back contracting.
A mega project site is a highly interdependent commercial ecosystem. The main contractor holds the overarching relationship with the developer, but the physical execution of the works.
The deep foundations, the structural steel, the intricate MEP systems, the facade engineering.
Yeah, all of that is almost entirely delivered by specialized subcontractors. When the main contractor's cash flow is constrained by a heavily amended fixed-price contract and rising global material costs, they invariably pass that constraint down to their supply chain.
The intelligence in the sources points to a severe crisis currently unfolding within the MEP mechanical, electrical, and plumbing subcontractor market across the region. We are seeing major, historically stable MEP firms facing critical insolvency events.
The MEP package is uniquely vulnerable in this setup.
Why is that?
Well, it is typically the largest single financial package on a project, and it's heavily reliant on the advanced imported components we discussed earlier, making it highly exposed to tariff and shipping shocks.
Right.
Furthermore, MEP works require massive upfront capital outlays for procurement, yet their installation and commissioning occur much later in the project lifecycle.
Meaning their cash flow is highly leveraged.
Extremely leveraged. So when the main contractor squeezes their payments or aggressively disputes their variations, these MEP firms simply run out of working capital. They go insolvent.
And the knock-on effect of a major subcontractor defaulting mid-project is catastrophic for the main contractor.
It derails the entire critical path. The main contractor is forced to immediately pull the defaulting subcontractor's performance bonds, which we will analyze the mechanics of shortly. But that doesn't solve the physical problem on site.
Right. You still need someone to build the thing.
Exactly. The main contractor now has to urgently procure a replacement subcontractor to take over a partially completed, heavily disputed package of work.
Which means they're paying a massive premium. The replacement subcontractor knows the main contractor is desperate, so they price the risk accordingly.
And the sources are incredibly blunt about the macro outcome of this cycle.
Yeah, the region is systematically receiving lower quality work for significantly higher ultimate costs.
Because the highly experienced Tier 1 subcontractors are being driven into insolvency by aggressive commercial tactics, main contractors are forced to rely on second- or third-tier firms who lack the capacity to deliver these complex assets.
Subcontractor default has elevated from a localized issue to a primary systemic project risk.
And this widespread financial distress is inextricably linked to the legal architecture governing these relationships. The root cause of so many of these insolvencies can be traced directly to the weaponization of back-to-back contracting.
Oh, this is fascinating. The mechanics of back-to-back clauses are notoriously complex. Under the fundamental legal doctrine of privity, a contract only binds the specific entities that sign it, right?
Theoretically, yes.
A subcontractor signing an agreement with a main contractor should only be concerned with the rights and obligations contained within those four corners. But back-to-back drafting intentionally fractures that principle.
It is a contractual mechanism designed to seamlessly transfer the main contractor's massive upstream liabilities down to the downstream supply chain.
It's like a Russian nesting doll of liabilities.
That's a perfect analogy. A back-to-back clause essentially states that the subcontractor assumes all the obligations, liabilities, and risks toward the main contractor that the main contractor has assumed toward the employer under the primary contract.
It creates an incredibly dangerous asymmetry of risk. A specialized subcontractor, perhaps delivering a highly specific interior fit-out package, believes they are executing a straightforward, limited scope agreement.
Right.
But through the inclusion of a back-to-back clause, they are suddenly legally bound by the massive, overarching administrative burdens, severe delay penalties, and complex dispute resolution mechanisms of a $500 million main contract that they likely haven't even fully read.
Or had the opportunity to negotiate. It is the primary engine of disputes on these projects.
I can see why.
The industry data analyzing the root causes of major arbitrations consistently identifies misaligned terms and duplicated conditions between main contracts and subcontracts as a leading trigger. The parties are operating on a shared site, but they are governed by entirely different interpretations of the commercial reality.
The misalignment regarding liquidated damages, or LDs, is a perfect example here.
Yes.
Liquidated damages are the predefined financial penalties levied for failing to deliver the project on time. A main contractor, relying on their back-to-back clause, often operates under the assumption that if the employer levies massive LDs against them for a delay, they can automatically pass those exact same massive penalties down to the subcontractor who caused the delay.
But the subcontractor is managing their risk based entirely on their specific subcontract, which almost certainly contains a negotiated hard cap on their liability for LDs.
Perhaps 5% or 10% of their specific subcontract value.
Right. So when the delay occurs, the main contractor attempts to pass down millions in upstream LDs, while the subcontractor points to their subcontract cap, limiting their exposure to a fraction of that amount.
And the commercial relationship instantly fractures into a massive legal dispute.
The exact same friction occurs with extensions of time. The main contract might have a highly restrictive list of qualifying delay events, perhaps only granting an EOT for unforeseeable exceptional weather or a formal change in law.
But the subcontract might contain a much broader list of excusable delays.
Exactly. The main contractor refuses to grant the sub extra time because the employer won't grant it upstream, while the subcontractor rightly claims they are contractually entitled to it based on their specific agreement.
But while those commercial misalignments are destructive, the most fatal trap within this back-to-back architecture revolves around notice provisions, specifically when they function as conditions precedent.
A condition precedent is essentially a procedural guillotine.
A procedural guillotine. That sounds intense.
It dictates that if a party fails to submit a formal written notice of a claim within a highly specific, rigid time frame, they entirely forfeit their legal right to pursue that claim,
Regardless of how legally or morally valid the claim might be on its merits.
completely extinguishes the entitlement. Yes. Now, consider the mechanics of a subcontractor getting caught in the crossfire of duplicated notice provisions.
Okay.
Let's say a critical delay occurs. Perhaps the main contractor fails to hand over a work front on time. The subcontractor reviews their specific subcontract, which stipulates they must provide formal notice of the delay within 14 days of the event occurring.
So the subcontractor's commercial team analyzes the impact, prepares the documentation, and officially submits the notice on day 12. From their perspective, they have perfectly complied with their contractual obligations.
However, the main contract, which the subcontractor is unknowingly bound to via the back-to-back clause, might dictate a much more aggressive condition precedent, requiring notice of any delay event within 7 days.
Oh, wow. So because the subcontractor adhered to the 14-day timeline in their specific agreement, they inevitably breached the 7-day timeline of the overarching main contract.
Exactly. And the main contractor will ruthlessly weaponize that missed 7-day deadline, using the back-to-back clause as a loophole to completely reject the subcontractor's perfectly valid claim.
That is brutal. The duplication and misalignment of these time bars is a deliberate trap.
It transforms project management into an exercise in adversarial paperwork warfare.
And this culture of aggressive risk avoidance leads directly to the widespread use of equivalent project relief clauses, commonly referred to as pay when paid or pay if paid mechanisms.
These clauses dictate that the main contractor has no legal obligation to grant an extension of time or to release payment for variations or claims to the subcontractor, unless and until the employer first grants that relief and releases those funds to the main contractor.
The subcontractor's cash flow and schedule relief become entirely contingent on the success of the main contractor's upstream negotiations.
The sources are careful to point out the jurisdictional divide here, though. In many mature common law jurisdictions, like the UK, strict pay-when-paid clauses have been statutorily outlawed because they are recognized as inherently destructive to the industry.
They starve the lower tiers of the supply chain of vital cash flow and drive small businesses into bankruptcy.
Exactly. But in the GCC, these clauses remain standard practice and are fully enforceable under local law.
They are the default mechanism for protecting the main contractor's cash flow. However, the application of these clauses is not absolute, right? This is where the legal mechanics become highly nuanced.
Right. A main contractor cannot simply hide behind a pay-when-paid clause if they themselves are the reason the payment hasn't been made.
Wait, so if a subcontractor submits a perfectly substantiated, fully quantified claim for a variation, the main contractor cannot just leave it sitting in a desk drawer. Like, they can't refuse to submit it to the employer because they're worried about damaging their relationship with the client, and then tell the subcontractor, sorry, we haven't been paid yet, so you don't get paid.
Precisely. If the main contractor fails to diligently and aggressively progress the subcontractor's valid claim up the contractual chain, the main contractor is in direct breach of their implied and often express obligations.
They cannot rely on the pay-when-paid defense if their own negligence or commercial timidity caused the non-payment.
This introduces a critical legal doctrine that the sources highlight, the prevention principle.
Okay, what's that?
This is a foundational concept rooted deeply in common law, but its core tenets are also heavily reflected in the good faith and performance obligations found throughout GCC civil codes.
The prevention principle operates as a fundamental safeguard against contractual abuse. At its core, it dictates that a party cannot legally benefit from their own breach.
Specifically, in a construction context, a main contractor cannot levy liquidated damages or enforce strict delay penalties against a subcontractor if the main contractor's own actions or inactions were the actual cause of the subcontractor's delay.
If the main contractor completely fails to provide the necessary scaffolding or delays the structural concrete pours, they cannot turn around and penalize the facade subcontractor for missing their installation dates.
Right, regardless of how aggressively the back-to-back clauses are drafted, you cannot actively obstruct someone's ability to perform and then financially penalize them for failing to perform.
That makes sense. That is the mechanical reality of the prevention principle.
Furthermore, the local civil codes in jurisdictions like the UAE and Saudi Arabia contain specific provisions governing mukawala, or contracts for work, which provide mechanisms for a subcontractor to seek remedies or terminate if the main contractor fundamentally obstructs their execution of the works.
However, successfully arguing these civil code protections in an arbitration setting, while simultaneously fighting against a fiercely drafted, bespoke back-to-back contract. I mean, that requires exceptional legal sophistication.
It really does, which perfectly sets the stage for the most explosive phase of these projects, when the environmental pressures compound, when the supply chains fracture, when the cascading delays trigger the condition precedents, and the subcontractors start teetering on the edge of insolvency.
The project environment becomes highly toxic.
Extremely.
The standard mechanisms of commercial negotiation, the emails, the site meetings, the warning letters, break down entirely. And when diplomacy fails, the parties inevitably reach for their ultimate contractual weapons.
The financial instruments that underwrite the entire project risk profile, the bonds and guarantees.
The deployment of these financial safety nets is arguably the most volatile aspect of GCC construction risk. Let's analyze the precise loadout of these instruments. To secure a mega project, a main contractor is required to mobilize a massive arsenal of bank guarantees.
The sheer volume of capital tied up in these instruments is staggering.
What's the standard security package look like?
It requires the contractor to provide an advance payment bond to secure the initial mobilization capital injected by the employer. Crucially, they must provide a performance bond, typically fixed at 10% of the total accepted contract amount, guaranteeing their execution of the works.
10% is a lot.
It is, and they are often required to provide a retention bond, usually another 5% to 10%, to secure their obligations during the defects liability period after the asset is handed over.
So on a flagship $2 billion infrastructure project, the main contractor might be required to lock up $400 million in bank guarantees.
Exactly. That represents a massive sustained draw on their corporate borrowing capacity and their working capital lines.
But the true danger isn't just the sheer scale of these bonds. It is the specific legal nature of how these bonds operate in the GCC market. The sources draw a massive, critical distinction between a default bond and an on-demand bond.
Understanding this mechanical difference is paramount. A default bond, which is more common in certain Western jurisdictions, requires the employer to provide objective, substantiated proof that the contractor is actually in material breach of the contract before the issuing bank will authorize a payout.
The bank requires evidence. Perhaps a formal determination by the independent engineer, or even a binding arbitral award confirming the contractor's default. It is a conditional instrument.
It requires due process. But the GCC is almost exclusively an on-demand bond market.
And the mechanics of an on-demand bond are absolute. It is an unconditional primary obligation of the bank.
It means the issuing bank is legally obligated to pay the employer the full face value of the bond immediately upon receiving their very first written demand.
The bank asks no questions. They do not investigate the underlying commercial dispute.
Not at all.
They do not care if the contractor's delay was caused by a massive, unforeseeable supply chain shock, or if the employer themselves is in material breach for failing to certify payments for 6 months. If the written demand is presented, the bank transfers the cash.
An on-demand bond is legally and functionally treated as liquid cash.
And the commercial fallout of an employer liquidating that bond is catastrophic for the contractor, because the bank is not absorbing that loss.
No, the very second the bank transfers that 10% of the project value to the employer, they instantaneously move to recover that exact amount directly from the contractor's corporate accounts.
It is an immediate, unannounced draining of the contractor's liquidity. The bank freezes their accounts, pulls their working capital lines, and seizes the collateral.
The contractor wakes up to find their entire corporate cash flow completely decimated.
Which creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of project failure.
Exactly. Once an on-demand bond is pulled, it becomes functionally impossible for the contractor to continue executing the works. They can no longer meet their massive weekly payroll, they cannot procure critical materials, and their supply chain instantly halts all deliveries.
Liquidating a performance bond is not a mechanism to get a project back on track. It almost invariably precedes the complete, acrimonious termination of the main contract. It is the commercial point of no return. It's like hitting the nuclear button.
It is the nuclear button.
Given that absolute severity, how does a contractor actually defend themselves? If an employer is acting in bad faith, perhaps using the sheer threat of calling the bond to bully the contractor into dropping a massive, highly valid claim for an extension of time, what is the defensive mechanism? Can a contractor legally stop the bank from transferring the money?
Historically, within the GCC, attempting to injunct an on-demand bond call was an exercise in futility.
The courts wouldn't stop it.
The local courts strictly upheld the autonomous, unconditional nature of the on-demand wording. The banking sector requires that certainty. However, the intelligence in the sources highlights a highly significant, evolving shift in regional jurisprudence.
Oh, that's interesting.
We are seeing GCC courts becoming increasingly sophisticated and willing to grant interim injunctions, formal court orders freezing the bank's payout, if the contractor can definitively prove exceptional circumstances.
What is the specific legal threshold for an exceptional circumstance in this context?
It is an exceptionally high bar. The contractor must usually demonstrate, with overwhelming, immediate documentary evidence, that the employer's bond call constitutes a clearly abusive act or outright fraud. It cannot just be a standard dispute over whether a delay was excusable or not.
It has to be egregious. For instance, if the contractor can present certified payment certificates proving the employer has completely failed to fund the project for a year, yet is now attempting to pull the performance bond, a judge might view that as a profoundly abusive act and grant the injunction to preserve the status quo until an arbitration tribunal can review the facts.
Precisely. But the sheer mechanics of securing that injunction present a massive logistical hurdle. Because it is an on-demand instrument, the employer could theoretically walk into the issuing bank in Dubai or Riyadh on a Tuesday morning, present the demand letter, and the bank processes the transfer that same day.
By the time the contractor even realizes what has happened, the cash is gone, and an injunction is useless.
Which is exactly why the sources introduce a vital, sophisticated contractual tool that Tier 1 contractors must demand during negotiations: the ICC Uniform Rules for Contract Guarantees.
Published by the International Chamber of Commerce.
Right. If a contractor can successfully negotiate to have their on-demand bonds specifically governed by these ICC rules, it completely alters the tactical landscape.
The ICC rules introduce a critical procedural safeguard. Under these specific rules, an employer cannot simply demand the funds blindly and anonymously.
The rules mandate that the employer must formally state the precise nature of the contractor's breach in their demand, and crucially, they mandate a specific notification process before the bank is authorized to execute the payout.
That pre-notification requirement is the entire key to survival. It forces the bank to pause.
It creates a vital, highly compressed window of opportunity. It gives the contractor a brief window, typically around 8 to 14 days, depending on the jurisdiction and the specific drafting, to urgently mobilize their legal teams, rush to the local courts, and file a substantive, heavily documented application for an emergency injunction, laying out the evidence of the employer's abusive act.
The sources shared a highly illustrative scenario regarding these mechanics. There's a complex dispute where an employer, locked in a fierce commercial battle with their contractor, attempted to aggressively liquidate an advance payment guarantee, intentionally treating it as if it were a general performance bond to inflict maximum financial pain.
But the contractor, utilizing the notification window, successfully secured an urgent court injunction freezing the payout.
Wow.
The court intervened because it looked closely at the strict mechanics of the underlying contract. The specific contract dictated that before any security could be liquidated, the employer had to formally issue a notice of termination, and there was a mandatory 30-day cure period allowing the contractor the opportunity to rectify the alleged breach.
The employer had arrogantly bypassed that entire 30-day cure period and gone straight for the cash.
Exactly. And the court recognized the abusive circumvention of the contract's mechanics and blocked the call. It demonstrates that local courts are increasingly willing to scrutinize the strict operational mechanics of the contract, provided the contractor can actually get their evidence in front of a judge in time.
Because securing these injunctions remains incredibly difficult and statistically improbable, employers are highly aware that relying solely on local bank bonds carries its own enforcement risks.
Therefore, they are increasingly demanding a dual-layered security approach.
They don't just want the liquid bank guarantees. They demand the ultimate corporate backstop, parent company guarantees, or PCGs.
This introduces a whole new layer of cross-border complexity.
If a massive regional developer is awarding a critical infrastructure package to a local subsidiary, say an LLC registered in Saudi Arabia, but that subsidiary is ultimately owned by a massive, highly capitalized global engineering conglomerate headquartered in Singapore, the developer will mandate a PCG.
They are essentially saying, if your localized Saudi entity fails to deliver, we have the legal right to bypass the corporate veil and access the massive balance sheet of your global headquarters in Singapore.
It provides the employer with a profound sense of security. But the sources provide a stark warning regarding the actual mechanical enforcement of these PCGs. They are fraught with severe jurisdictional and operational traps.
It is functionally useless for a Saudi developer to win a judgment against the Singaporean parent company in a local Saudi court if the parent company holds absolutely zero physical or financial assets within Saudi Arabia.
Enforcing a local judgment in a foreign jurisdiction without highly specific reciprocal bilateral treaties is a legal nightmare. The developer might hold a piece of paper saying they are owed $100 million, but they have no mechanism to actually seize the assets in Singapore.
Which means the actual drafting of the PCG is critical. To be effective, the PCG itself must be explicitly governed by the laws of the jurisdiction where the parent company's assets actually reside. In this scenario, Singapore law, and it must be subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of the Singapore courts or recognized international arbitration seats.
Negotiating this requires extremely careful, highly specialized, cross-border legal counsel.
And beyond the jurisdictional issues, there is a fundamental operational trap hidden in how PCGs are structured, the crucial distinction between a guarantee of performance versus a guarantee of payment.
This is a highly misunderstood mechanic. An employer often demands a PCG guaranteeing the actual performance of the works.
But think about the physical reality. If the specialized Saudi subsidiary goes into liquidation halfway through a complex, deep foundation package, the global holding company in Singapore cannot simply dispatch a board of directors and a crew of Singaporean executives to Riyadh to start pouring specialized concrete.
Right. The parent company lacks the local operating licenses, the localized supply chain relationships, and the specific on-the-ground labor capacity.
A strict guarantee of physical performance is practically impossible to enforce. It is an illusion.
Precisely. Therefore, a legally sound PCG must be drafted strictly as a guarantee of financial compensation. It must guarantee that the parent company will indemnify the employer for the quantifiable financial losses incurred by the subsidiary's failure, not guarantee that the parent company will physically step in and finish the building.
Understanding these granular mechanics is what separates successful project delivery from catastrophic litigation.
Okay, if you are listening to this and mapping these risks onto your current portfolio, the sheer density of exposure, the compounding heat delays, the 7% tariff hits, the fracturing supply chains, the heavily amended FIDI contracts, the condition precedents, and the constant threat of on-demand bond liquidations is overwhelming.
It paints an incredibly hostile picture.
But the intent of this deep dive is not to paralyze you with risk. We are here to arm you with the precise tactical responses.
It is time to transition from mapping the minefield to detailing the exact mechanics of how to successfully cross it.
We have arrived at the 2026 Master Playbook. The intelligence in these sources lays out the exact, actionable blueprints that the most sophisticated developers and the highly profitable Tier 1 contractors are utilizing to survive and thrive in this environment.
It begins with fully institutionalizing the 7 core principles of risk management.
Let's run through them.
These principles cannot just be a slide in a corporate presentation. They must be mechanically embedded into the daily operating procedures of every project team. First, the rigorous identification of risks long before they manifest on the critical path.
Spot problems early.
Second, the precise allocation of those risks. Is this an unforeseeable physical condition that should firmly rest with the employer under standard FIDIC principles? Or is it a foreseeable supply chain constraint that the contractor must absorb?
Third, the hard quantification of the risk. Every identified risk must have a calculated statistical probability and a hard model dollar cost attached to its impact.
Fourth, aggressive mitigation. If the risk is material delay, the mitigation is actively resequencing the baseline schedule or executing forward purchasing agreements.
Fifth, continuous monitoring through highly integrated, real-time digital dashboards.
Sixth, the contractual treatment. Ensuring that the commercially agreed allocation of risk is actually legally codified in the bespoke amendments, removing any ambiguity.
And seventh, transparent reporting. Maintaining absolute, unfiltered visibility for all stakeholders, including the client, so that a delayed shipment is a shared problem to solve, not a surprise breach of contract.
But the sources are incredibly emphatic that all of those principles ultimately coalesce into one singular, non-negotiable mechanism. The absolute most critical tool for survival on a GCC megaproject is the maintenance of a live, dynamic construction risk register.
It is the central nervous system of project management. A static PDF created during the tender phase and forgotten in a drawer is useless.
Completely useless. A true live risk register is a continuously updated, heavily scrutinized database that tracks every single emerging threat, assigns strict ownership to a specific individual for managing it, and actively tracks the financial and schedule mitigation efforts.
The intelligence is unequivocal on this point. The absence of a fiercely maintained live risk register during the construction phase is the single most reliable, predictive indicator that a project is hurtling toward a massive, catastrophic arbitration.
If you aren't tracking the risks are managing you.
Which leads directly into the specific, tactical execution required for 2026. The intelligence outlines a highly specific 10-point action plan. The most critical intervention occurs right at the very beginning of the project lifecycle, drastically increasing the budget for commercial and legal support during the tendering and mobilization phases.
We discussed earlier how the lowest bid mentality causes contractors to slash their internal costs to win the job. The data shows that this is commercial suicide.
The sources mandate that contractors must actively budget for dedicated, highly experienced quantity surveying teams, specialized external legal counsel, and forensic quantum and delay specialists before the contract is signed and mobilized.
The ROI on this early commercial investment is astronomical. Spending a fraction of a percent of the total project value to properly resource the commercial team ensures that when the massive variations arrive or when the critical delays occur, the contractor actually has the administrative machinery in place to strictly comply with the notice provisions.
They can perfectly substantiate the cost impact and successfully secure their entitlement. You cannot win a complex extension of time claim if you don't have the commercial personnel to write the notices.
And those highly resourced commercial teams must immediately execute the next critical tactic: exhaustive contractual due diligence. Contractors must operate under the absolute assumption that standard, equitable contract forms will not govern their risk.
This standard, unamended printed text of a FIDIC contract is essentially irrelevant in this market. The employer's external legal counsel will always draft highly bespoke, heavily modified, particular conditions.
These special conditions are where the true commercial traps, the shifted ground risk, the brutal condition precedents, the cap delay damages are hidden.
The commercial team must treat those special conditions as the only contract that matters. They must meticulously read every single amendment, map the resulting risk transfer, and aggressively push back during negotiations against clauses that impose unquantifiable risk, like forcing a lump sum price on incomplete IFC drawings.
And that rigorous pushback must extend to the baseline scheduling. Contractors must completely abandon the practice of committing to impossible, artificially compressed timelines simply to look appealing during the tender presentation.
You have to build a schedule that reflects physical reality. A realistic baseline must mathematically account for the MOHRE summer working bans, the highly probable supply chain disruptions, and the required float for complex testing and commissioning.
And crucially, it must be paired with confirmed, transparent project funding.
The era of speculative megaprojects is closing. Contractors can no longer afford to mobilize massive resources on a partially funded development, operating on the dangerous hope that the developer will successfully secure the remaining tranches of mezzanine financing by the time the project reaches 60% completion.
In the volatile 2026 economic environment, the risk of the client's liquidity evaporating mid-build is far too severe. Tier 1 contractors must demand contractual visibility and absolute verification that the entire capital stack for the project is fully secured and ring-fenced before they pour a single cubic meter of concrete.
It all comes down to forcing reality into the planning stage. But once the project is live, the tactical advice shifts in a really fascinating way. Despite all the necessary focus on 5D BIM, digital twins, and algorithmic scheduling, the sources strongly emphasize a return to highly structured, old-school face-to-face management.
Because digital tools are exceptional at identifying bottlenecks, but they are entirely incapable of resolving human commercial disputes. Relying solely on cold, formal contractual notices uploaded into a sterile project management portal creates a highly adversarial, low-trust environment.
The intelligence stresses that sitting across the table with the employer's project management and commercial teams, maintaining regular, high-frequency face-to-face dialogue, is the most effective mechanism for managing expectations and securing vital cash flow.
It is about building a proactive, early warning culture. You don't wait for the delay to hit the critical path and then send a hostile legal notice.
You sit down weeks in advance and say, "We have early indicators that the specialized chiller units are delayed at the port. Let's collaboratively resequence the roof works to mitigate the delay before it costs both of us money."
That transparency builds invaluable commercial trust, and it ties directly into another key tactical directive: highly selective dispute management. Contractors must actively stop wasting their limited commercial resources fighting every single minor, non-critical variation or low-value delay event.
Focus your commercial firepower. Do not poison the client relationship over a minor change in a paint specification. Conserve that energy and legal capital strictly for events that demonstrably impact the critical path and unequivocally fall under the employer's contractual risk allocation.
And when those major critical disputes do inevitably arise, the final and arguably most transformative tactical shift for 2026 is aggressively pushing for faster dispute resolution mechanisms.
The traditional GCC model is profoundly broken. The standard practice has always been to essentially ignore the major commercial disputes, sweep the delayed payments, and the massive extension of time claims under the rug in the name of getting the job done, and then, years after the building is handed over, the parties spend tens of millions of dollars on elite law firms battling it out in a massive, multi-year arbitration.
Which structurally starves the contractor of vital cash flow during the actual execution phase, often driving them into the very insolvencies we discussed earlier. The modern playbook demands that contractors proactively negotiate and utilize swift, interim dispute resolution mechanisms designed to solve issues during the project lifecycle.
The prime example being the mandatory inclusion of dispute adjudication boards, or DABs.
A properly functioning DAB fundamentally changes the cash flow dynamics of a project. It is a panel of highly experienced, independent, technical, and legal experts appointed at the very inception of the project. They visit the site regularly and understand the real-time context.
When a massive dispute arises mid-project, say a severe disagreement over the valuation of a major design variation, the parties do not wait for arbitration. They refer the issue immediately to the DAB.
And the DAB conducts a rapid review and issues a swift, interim binding decision, often within a matter of weeks. The crucial mechanism here is that the employer is legally obligated to immediately pay the contractor based on that interim decision, injecting the necessary cash flow back into the site.
If the employer still vehemently disagrees with DAB's valuation at the end of the project, they can formally challenge it in arbitration later, but the immediate critical cash flow crisis that could have halted the project is entirely averted.
Furthermore, for smaller, less complex commercial disputes, contractors should heavily advocate for clauses allowing binding mediation or swift expert determination. The overarching strategy is clear. Resolve the commercial friction in real time on the physical site to maintain the operational momentum rather than hoarding the disputes for a distant, destructive courtroom battle.
The mechanics of survival are incredibly complex, but the path forward is clear. Let's synthesize the core intelligence from this deep dive. The absolute reality of GCC construction in 2026 is that delivering a mega project is no longer merely an exercise in advanced structural engineering. The engineering is assumed. The true challenge is executing a profoundly complex, high-stakes legal, financial, and environmental chess match.
That is the operational reality of the market.
You're managing teams in an environment where a measurable 1.6-degree global temperature rise dictates strict, mandatory changes to your scheduling logic and physical material handling. You are navigating highly volatile global trade fragmentation that can instantly slap a 7% premium onto the specialized ESG materials you are legally mandated to procure.
You have to meticulously deconstruct back-to-back subcontracts to ensure a duplicated notice provision doesn't trap your entire supply chain.
And you are executing all of this while operating under the constant existential threat of an unconditional on-demand performance bond that can instantly vaporize your corporate liquidity.
Success in this highly adversarial environment requires absolute, rigorous commercial discipline. Operating on optimism or relying on the historical strength of client relationships is no longer a viable corporate strategy. A heavily resourced, highly aggressive commercial team, the flawless execution of a live risk register, and a forensic, granular mastery of your bespoke special conditions. That is the only proven strategy for survival.
But before we conclude this deep dive, there is a final, highly provocative thought that emerges when you analyze the trajectory of all the intelligence we've covered today. A fundamental question regarding the future architecture of the industry. As the physical climate impacts inevitably worsen, as the global supply chains continue to structurally fracture, and as the acceptable profit margins are compressed to the absolute breaking point, the traditional, fiercely adversarial contracting model we've analyzed today feels entirely unsustainable.
The model where employers utilize bespoke FIDIC amendments to aggressively shove all the risk down onto the main contractors, who then utilize back-to-back clauses to shove it all down onto the highly vulnerable subcontractors, it seems destined to collapse under the weight of its own compounding liabilities.
It raises a profound question about the necessary evolution of the GCC market. To execute the next generation of these unprecedented megaprojects, will the industry be forced to abandon the adversarial lump sum model entirely?
Will we see a structural shift toward highly collaborative, open-book alliance contracting, a commercial architecture where the developer, the Tier 1 contractor, and the critical specialist subcontractors formally pool the project risk, share the financial contingencies equally, and treat these massive environmental and supply chain shocks as shared operational challenges to be solved collectively, rather than using risk allocation as a weapon to destroy each other's balance sheets?
The data suggests is either a shift toward that integrated alliance model, or the current ecosystem simply fractures completely. Thank you for joining us on this highly technical deep dive into your sources. Continue to interrogate your supply chains, rigorously pressure test your risk registers, and above all else, ensure your legal teams forensically deconstruct the special conditions in your contracts. Because as the intelligence is clearly demonstrated today, until you have mapped every single legal and commercial exposure, that pristine 3D architectural render is nothing more than a dangerous illusion hiding deeply muddy waters.